Now, April is marked as World Autism Month, but the South African Journal of Childhood Education notes that are not reliable studies giving figures of people living with autism in South Africa due to stigma, poor access to medical interventions, underdiagnosis, and cultural misperceptions. Let's unpack autism in adults with Jackie Selley, Director of the Center for Autism Research and Education. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. April is World Autism Month, and you say there is not enough education about autism, and those with the disability are often stigmatized and marginalized by society. What messaging do you feel needs to be communicated this time around?
I think it's more about awareness and acceptance that people with autism are still people. They have dreams and hopes just like any one of us. They just think and have slightly different development to us. There needs to be more awareness about where our adults with autism are going to. There aren't enough placements. There isn't enough funding. There's a lack of support for the NGOs who are supporting people with autism. So that's kind of the message that we'd like to raise now.
Yeah. In the midst of that stigma, being marginalized by society and the cultural misperceptions, what effect does autism have on families in terms of coping and the complicated requirements sometimes of a person with autism?
So autism is an extremely complex neurodevelopmental disability or disorder, and it presents, every person with autism is different. So there's a huge amount of stress placed on the family and on the person themselves, and it's an extremely expensive to support your child who has autism. There aren't enough facilities to support the children, and there aren't enough facilities for our adults. We find that parents often separate because of this, the stigma and the guilt associated with having a child with autism. Often there's a lot of pressure by the community, by the extended family in relation to the parenting of the child, opinions about how the child should be supported. So yes, there's a lot of pressure on families.
What about some of the very dangerous myths that have been going around? I mean, perhaps give us some clarity on what people are saying and how they're getting it so terribly wrong.
I think you're referring to the vaccine and the MMR. There was a myth that the MMR vaccine was related to the development of autism. This was proven, the research around this was proven to be fraudulent. What happened is that around the time when the children have this MMR vaccine, there's a lot of complex things going on in the brain. And while these complex things go on in the brain, some changes happen that may or may not result in a child having autism. And it doesn't have anything, it's nothing related to the MMR, to a vaccine at all. So children should receive their vaccines. It's very important to protect them. I think another myth is that autism is a spectrum, so that it's linear. Autism is not linear. It is, in fact, more of a color palette. So every person with autism has different strengths and different challenges. So you can't put a child or an adult with autism into one box and say, this is what autism looks like. It's really a color palette, a spectrum.
So you mentioned the expenses around the medication. What about the challenges of access to medical interventions, underdiagnosis, and sometimes overdiagnosis? So
certainly within Gauteng, the diagnosis of children with autism has become a lot better over the last 10 years. There is access to a lot of health facilities, government health facilities where children will receive support. The lack of support seems to be around the therapeutic support. Therapy is extremely expensive, and parents who can't privately fund the therapy, the children tend to receive quite sporadic therapy, and that is very difficult.
We know that the education department and the private sector have provided significant support for children with autism, but of course, I mean, there are still some loopholes, especially for adolescents and adults. How are they particularly affected?
So yes, the health sector and the education sector have really come to the fore in the past 5 to 10 years and have provided a lot more support, a lot more funding. But unfortunately, Department of Social Development is lagging very far behind. There are far and few between centers for adults and adolescents with autism. In fact, thinking offhand, there's 1 or 2 centers for adults with autism in Gauteng and 1 or 2 in the Cape. It's really, I mean, if we look at the 50 to 100 classes for children with autism within the government sector, and then a lot of private schools and classes, now we have 4 centers within South Africa for adults. Where are our adults? Where are our young people that graduate from school going to? They're going into the home, and when their parents become elderly, where do they go to? There's nowhere. There's no support, no funding.
Yeah, the Education Department has also reiterated the importance of government creating the best conditions for people with autism, saying they should perhaps improve on infrastructure and resources in special needs schools so that there is some form of balance in all of them. How are they faring so far?
They really have done quite well within the education sector. They are looking at work. They are looking at even inclusion. They're looking at how they can develop the programs within the autism schools. So they really have done quite well. But that gap between when a child goes into, or a young person ends high school or ends their senior phase, and then where to go to. There's a huge gap there because there's no, certainly within the tertiary education section, there's not accommodation for autism. Universities are not accommodating at all, which is really sad. They really lack in understanding of autism. And within our workplace and our skills creations, there are not many workshops. There tends to be the stigma against our adolescents and adults with autism, and it really comes out, in that sector.
Where to go is really a very important question. What would you suggest? I mean, what needs to happen to bridge that gap?
So at the moment, there's where the most progress is happening is with our NGOs and within the private sector. They're driving this support for adults with autism. We really need government to partner with these NGOs. I know that the NGO sector within Gauteng is receiving a cut in budgets in the next year. That's a huge problem because they are the ones driving this. They are the ones creating partnerships with private companies so we can get our young people bursaries, so they can get the skills creation and go into the open labor market, into sheltered employment, or even support the families at home. There's just this lack of support. So we need to partner with the government. They need to support the NGOs that are working towards this cause.
And very lastly, before we let you go, Jackie, if there are parents or perhaps, people sitting at home watching and listening and with a child or an adolescent or perhaps even an adult with autism, what would you advise? I mean, it really can be draining psychologically, especially with the lack of understanding.
So there are NGOs such as Autism South Africa that can provide support. CARE works alongside and we refer quite a lot to the work that Autism South Africa does, and they provide a lot of important research, a lot of important support for our communities with autism. So really, if you need support, reach out to them, or you're welcome to reach out to us at the Centre for Autism Research and Education. And we're able to support you.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time and enlightening conversation. That Jackie Selley, the Director of the Centre of Autism Research and Education.